Dennis.
I'm Becca Blackburn, and today we're going to talk about The Making of an Ordinary Saint by Nathan Foster.
So, Becca, when you were reading the book, what did you feel like was most life-giving?
Yeah, Nathan does a really good job of approaching the disciplines from the view of grace, and so it didn't feel at all claustrophobic about practicing the disciplines. It felt really natural, like receiving the disciplines and opportunities to practice them in normal ways. And so I think the thing that was most life-giving for me was that he taught the idea that we have to accept the fact that we're sojourners on this journey, which as soon as I can accept the fact that it's a process, that I don't have to get it perfect the first time I try fasting, I don't have to be perfectly submissive after a week of practice,
Right.
then it's a lot easier to accept my shortcomings and extend grace to myself.
Yeah.
And then it's easier to extend grace to other people who are also in process.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, there was a lot of Nathan saying, these opportunities already existed in my life. I didn't set out and say, I'm going to practice XXX. But instead, as soon as I started paying attention, things popped up that were just natural.
Yeah, that was
you were saying.
I definitely highlighted that part because it was oh, good. God is actually part of this with me. And as soon as he sees that, hey, Andra's willing, now I'm going to help her pay attention to the opportunities that are already there. And that was just a relief. Oh, good. I don't have to figure all of this out on my own.
Well, I feel like it took the pressure off of, I need to pull God into this moment. And instead say, God's already in this moment. It's just whether or not I am paying attention and willing to recognize where God is.
Yes.
In the moment.
And I think I'm finding that's a theme in a lot of these books, is that change is always the goal, that we're being transformed, but the method is always paying attention. It's kind of that meditative approach to seeing God already there.
Well, and super individual. The way that I'm seeing God show up is different than the ways that you're seeing that, and the things that I'm practicing are different. Even though you and I are reading the same books and living similar lives, still the things are very unique.
Yeah, which then allows for a lot of room for diversity in the church.
Right.
We can appreciate it a lot more because we say, hey, you're on a journey, I'm on a journey. They look different, but as long as we're both paying attention to God as best we can support each other in that process.
Right. Absolutely.
So what about you? What did you find life-giving in this book?
So I felt a lot of freedom in this book. So I've read Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, and then hearing Richard Foster speak last year at Residency about the disciplines kind of started to open that door towards freedom. And then I feel like Nathan's book swung that door wide open and said your practice of the disciplines is your practice. And I felt for me, there's a huge breath of air in that idea. And just the sense that I will not do XXX in a linear way, and that's okay. And God's not expecting me to practice in a linear way. And I think the way that Nathan brings in his whole life, his teaching and his kids and his outdoor activities, is really allowed a good glimpse for me of, this is supposed to be way more individual than what I had previously thought.
Yes. I took a lot of relief, we could say, in his story about solitude. So he talks about how he was a lover of solitude, and then family life happened, and he had to learn to cope with that. And then it was time to go back and relearn to appreciate solitude. And so he had this wonderful weekend away, and then he felt really close to God and at peace. And then he walks in the front door of his house, and his kids are like, "Dad!" And he's just okay, I'm not ready for this. And so he just very simply said, I hadn't yet learned the whole lesson. I have to keep going back to solitude to figure it out. And that just says, good. It's not one specific type of solitude will solve that problem for you. Check that discipline off your list. It's, I have to keep returning, maybe trying different methods. And that's part of the beauty of the relationship with God, really, is that it's not uniform.
Yeah. Well, and finding ways that it fits into your actual life, and not saying I did something wrong because I came back to my family and it felt really difficult. But instead saying okay, I had this experience this weekend. My family life does not match that same level of solitude. So what does it look like to find a space in between those? You know, and what does it look like to say, like, okay, so maybe this isn't optimal, but that doesn't make it bad.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So was there anything in the book that felt life-draining or difficult for you?
I think for me, it was really difficult to read Nathan's story about the bike ride because I saw so much of myself in that. Like, as Nathan is recognizing that he has a bad attitude, and then that process of surrendering the bad attitude, because to me, like, that happens. That totally happens with me. And part of the whole thing is that I may recognize, like, okay, my attitude's a choice and I can choose to fix it. But there's part of me that says, like, and I'm going to choose not to.
Yes, that stubbornness.
Yeah. And so, like, seeing that in the book and then seeing another character deal with that was, I mean, like, that's going to be the most abrasive part because it's the part of me that needs to change the most.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I would say I felt a similar thing. The end of every chapter has that portrait of, like, here's a historical figure that models this discipline well.
Yeah.
And I knew about a lot of them already, but reading through Nathan's chapters felt like freedom. Like, okay, there's grace, there's room to practice, and then I would get to the portrait and be like, oh, well, they got it down already. Like, why aren't I there? Like, so that felt a little suffocating, but I would agree with you. That's not the book's fault. If anything, it just points out, like, where I'm at on my journey. And because, I mean, this was actually another part of Nathan's book worth talking about is the interludes, where he talks about the self-hatred narrative and the difficulty we all have in embracing ourselves. That I'm on that part of my journey where I'm learning to embrace myself and to eschew self-hatred, to receive God's love. And so the portraits, like, were kind of like a trigger for me, like a taunt, like, hey, Becca, look at this person who's doing it so perfectly. And I have to intentionally read through those and say, like, awesome, praise God for your story. That's not my story right now. I'm somewhere else on my journey. And a lot of those portrait people had to struggle through what we're struggling through before they got to the point where they were actually executing the discipline well. So,
Right. Well, and I think, too, with the portraits, it's hard because you're looking at somebody's whole life. There's, like, when we're reading the books and being introspective, like, we're looking at, like, right now.
yes.
This is where I am right now. And the other thing is, like, we have, like, the one-on-one view of it as opposed to, like, somebody having a more distanced view and looking at us. Because, like, I'm sure you've experienced, like, you get different feedback from other people than the feedback you give to yourself.
Yes.
And I really thought about that in those interludes, and especially self-hatred. It just made me think, like, I wouldn't say those things to somebody else, but I say them to myself. You know, and then changing, like, what does it look like to change the inner monologue?
Yes. Yep. Which I would say just loops back to paying attention. Like, we change the inner monologue by watching for where God is already showing up in our lives, embracing the moment as best as we humanly can.
Right.
And then letting the words inside our head change as they're replaced with God's words.
Which, like, when you look at your life progressively, like, okay, I think that a lot of us have made progress in that. It's just taking the time to step back and say, like, okay, where am I on the journey and the spectrum?
Yeah. I thought it was a great book.
Me too.
And I think it ties in well with a lot of other books that we're looking at for residency.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
You too.